Hi Lighthouse, it's Pastor Francis here, and for this week's videos, we are going to be back in the Psalms. Now, when you read through the Psalms, there is this interesting interplay between a couple of things that I think are happening. On the one hand, the Psalms are incredibly honest about the human experience. They are filled with raw emotion. Some of the protests and questions that the psalmists bring to God might even make us scratch our heads a little bit and wonder, is that okay to ask God? Is that okay to say of God? And yet, on the other hand, as unfiltered as these psalms are, in many of them, we still observe a discernible shape or pattern to them. There is this consistent movement toward God. The psalmists don't just passively remain in their own emotions, as raw as they are, but they're actively bringing them before God. And I think we're meant to learn both of those parts as we read through the Psalms. And yes, they give us language to voice our honest emotions to God, but they also teach us the practice and the discipline of moving towards Him, even when life is hard. And so for this video, we're going to be in Psalm 77. And the specific discipline that we learn from Asaph, who is the writer of this psalm, is the discipline of meditation. In Psalm 77, we get a picture of what it looks like to meditate on God's works in the past in order to gain perspective on where God is and who God is in the midst of some really difficult circumstances in the present. Now, what is meditation? Well, meditation connects our minds with our hearts. Richard Baxter, he described it as reading the Bible in such a way as to make your heart hot. In meditation, we don't just escape or forget the circumstances of our lives, but rather we bring the truth of who God is and what He has said down into what we are experiencing. And this is what Psalm 77 teaches us. When you're unsure of where God is in the present, then rehearse what He has done in the past. In the first half of this psalm, verses 1 to 9, we hear and we see a sufferer who's discouraged and hopeless and exhausted, even feeling abandoned by God. Look at verse 1. It says, I cry aloud to God, and He will hear me. In the day of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night, my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. When I remember God, I moan. When I meditate, my spirit faints. And so Asaph is so troubled that he's losing sleep, and he blames God for that. He says, God, it's your fault. He prays for relief and comfort, but it feels like his prayers are going unanswered, that they're just hitting the ceiling and kind of just stopping there. In verses 7 to 9, his doubts and his questions are even more extreme. Look at what he says. He says, will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has His steadfast love forever ceased? Are His promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His compassion? So basically, Asaph asks, has God changed? Because it certainly feels like He has. And His steadfast love doesn't feel steadfast anymore. His promises don't feel like they're true anymore. And that's our temptation when things get hard, isn't it? When the world has changed, when our circumstances have changed, we can start to feel as if maybe God has changed. But I think even here in Asaph's brutally honest questions, we see the value of bringing them before God. And in our act of asking, we allow God to begin to change us. I mean, these are real questions, but Asaph begins to realize that despite how he feels, that there is still one undeniable answer to all of these questions, and it's that God hasn't changed. Derek Kidner, as a commentator, he puts it like this: if steadfast love is pledged in His covenant, it can hardly disappear or His promises come to nothing. And to ask, has God forgotten, is to invite only one reply. And so these questions lead Asaph to meditate on God's work in the past. And if you look at verses 10 to 12, he uses a bunch of different parallel words, and they're meant to communicate just the broad scope and the broad sweep of Asaph's meditation. He says, I will appeal and remember and ponder and meditate on God's deeds and wonders and works and acts. He says, I'm going to do a thorough consideration. I'm going to look long and wide to remember all that God has done in the past so that I can rightly interpret who he is in the present. And specifically in the second half of the psalm, he's going to recount God's power and salvation seen in the exodus of his people from out of Egypt. Just a couple things I want to pick out from these verses. Look at verse 19. Asaph says, your way was through the sea. Now, I don't think any Israelite who was standing there on the banks of the Red Sea with the Egyptians in pursuit of them would have imagined that God's plan for them involved going through the water, right? Going through that Red Sea. But here's Asaph in Psalm 77. He has the privilege of being able to look back in retrospect, and he realizes that God's ways aren't our ways. That what doesn't make sense to us in the moment is really God's demonstration of power given the right perspective. And how much do we need that reminder right now? I mean, can we say, God, your way is through COVID-19? Give me eyes of faith to believe that even though I don't understand it right now. And if you look at the last verse of this psalm, verse 20, psalms like this, they typically move from personal cries of despair to it ends with these declarations of worship. They say things like, I will praise or I will worship. But here in Psalm 77, Asaph's personal circumstances kind of just fade away and it ends up into Israel's deliverance story. But I think that's the point. As Pastor Kim has often reminded us, we are all part of God's bigger story. And if God has proven his character and if he's coming through on all of his promises to his people in the past throughout history, we can trust that if we're part of his story, then we're not going to be the first exception. And so do you find yourself feeling unsure of where God is in the present, as if God has changed just like everything else in your life has changed? Then let Psalm 77 teach you how to meditate on God's goodness and faithfulness and power to you in the past. You know, for Asaph, his greatest demonstration of God's salvation was the exodus from Egypt. But of course, for us, the greatest demonstration of salvation that we can look back on is a greater act of salvation, and that's Jesus' death on the cross for us. And so what evidences of God's work in the past can you anchor yourself on? And try to be specific. What are things that you can point to in your own life or in the lives of others? But don't stop there. To meditate is to draw out the significance of the things that we remember. And so with all of those things you just recounted of God's goodness, what does that lead you to today? You know, if this is true of who God is, then how should that shape the way that I think about where I am at right now? And so Lighthouse, may we be people who are confidently and freshly aware of who God is in the past, in the present, and even into the unknown future.